I feel a degree of trepidation in making this video, and that's natural. I don't speak Sicilian, unfortunately, but there are at least two reasons I want to go ahead with it anyway. The first is consistency. As you will know, we've made videos on the pronunciation of medieval Romance languages, Old Spanish sibilants, Old French sibilants, and the sibilants of Galician Portuguese. And so naturally it's time to look at the sibilants of Italian in the Middle Ages. But as you will know, that's extremely difficult because Italy in the Middle Ages was notoriously politically divided. That is to say, if we were looking at medieval Italian, that means that we need to look at the language of the various courts that represented the numerous polities that made up the Italian peninsula at any given point in the Middle Ages. That lack of centralization poses a problem for the historical linguist, and much more a problem for the amateur like myself. The second motive for which I wanted to make this video is much more personal. I love Sicily and I love Sicilian. Unfortunately, I've not yet had a chance to visit the place, but the history of Sicily fascinates me, and the language itself I find extremely beautiful. I should mention here that one of the first exposures I had to Sicilian as a language was Cristina Pluhar's beautiful album La Tarantella, which has music from the south of Italy in general, but specifically has some songs, such as Silenzio d'Amore, from Sicily. So, without further ado, let's look at what the sibilants of medieval Sicilian might have been. I think it makes sense to ground ourselves first in the pronunciation of modern Sicilian sibilants. Unfortunately, there exists a lot of resources to back us up here. One of them is the wonderful I Love Languages channel here on YouTube. I recommend you go and check out their videos on modern Sicilian there. They're really interesting. But as is the form on this channel, I'd like to divide our sibilants into various classes: the dental alveolar sibilants and the post-alveolar sibilants. Starting with the first category, let's look at the fricatives. And of course, the fricatives always come in voiced and unvoiced varieties. The simplest sibilant, s, is the unvoiced dental alveolar fricative. That, in modern Sicilian, is spelt with the simple S. And I'd like to use for attestation this wonderful Sicilian Wikipedia article on Federico II Hohenstaufen. In that article, one of the very first lines we read mentions the Sacro Romanum Imperum, referring to the Holy Roman Empire. As a side point, I find it interesting that modern Sicilian doesn't seem to actually follow the norm in other Romance languages of having the intervocalic S voiced. A nose in Sicilian is a nasu, not a nasu, as I would have initially thought. Correct me there if I'm wrong, any Sicilian speakers out there. The voiced version of the sibilant, z, seems to come in instances when that S precedes another voiced consonant. The article we are talking about, for example, makes reference to Federico II de Hohenstaufen di Svevia, not Svevia. This makes sense to me. It just seems so natural to voice a sibilant when it comes before voiced consonants like v or b. It also seems to occur in instances where the S comes after an N in Sicilian. So, for example, the article we're talking about makes reference later on to the Figlia du Regi Alfonso d'Aragona. So much for the fricatives of the dental alveolar sibilants. Let's check out their affricates quickly. The first is the unvoiced ts, which is spelt as Z, as we see in this instance from the article Che era grossa perché era granuzza di tatti. The voiced counterpart z also exists in modern Sicilian, and it's spelt with a Z after the nasal consonant n. And so this line in our article would be pronounced something like La nascita di Costanza era importante. Now, I hope I've done justice to these dental alveolar sibilants in Sicilian. Please let me know down in the comments below if you're unsatisfied with my pronunciation and if you actually have some serious errors to correct there. But from my understanding of what I've looked at, this is an accurate representation. Let's move on to the post-alveolar sibilants in Sicilian, and we will start off with the unvoiced fricative sh. Like modern Italian, this is represented with the grapheme SC before I or E. We've seen this before just in the example I gave with La nascita di Costanza. It's also seen in the C with Sedilia, according to the I Love Languages channel, which pronounces cousin in Sicilian as Ucuscinu or a cucina. The voiced counterpart is in fact the sibilant I feel least comfortable in because I've found contrasting theories and contrasting explanations even in modern Sicilian grammars on this particular topic. Some say that it's merely an alternative regional pronunciation of the above phoneme sh. So some Sicilian speakers might not say u cuscino but u cugino. Others say that with the Sicilian diagraphs s, b, and sv, it's actually the normal pronunciation. So for example, if I'm talking about a mistake I make in Sicilian, I might refer to it as a sbaglio. The question I have here is, then wouldn't that apply in instances like we've seen above, with Svevia instead of Svevia? Interestingly, I noticed that in the I Love Languages Sicilian video, the narrator actually uses this sound when he says cinque, the word for 5. Again, I rely on you if you are Sicilian. Please clarify this for me. I looked online and I even asked on forums, but I couldn't find any serious clarification for this point. Is this really a different phoneme per se, or is it just a different regional pronunciation of the unvoiced sh? So those are the post-alveolar fricatives. Let's look at the post-alveolar affricates. The first is the unvoiced ch, which, like in modern Italian, is spelled with C before I or E, as in the case of Federico II di Sicilia, and the voiced version, j, is spelled with a G before an I or E. We might talk about how Federico II di Sicilia also attempted to become the Re di Germania. So far, so normal for Romance languages, but there's something that's really cool about Sicilian, and that's the retroflex sibilants. I don't think there's another Romance language that has these. Maybe Romanian does, but certainly the Romance languages I'm most familiar with, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and modern Italian, don't have these retroflex sibilants. And what I'm referring to here are the sibilant sounds that appear where the diagraphs st and st appear in writing. In our article, we find this in this narrative line: Naturalmente è costrito a rintrari, e lo papo lo scomunica. I hope I've done that justice. It's actually a pretty difficult sound to replicate, I must say. But if you're looking for a much more accurate rendition of that, please look at I Love Languages Sicilian video. You'll get a more authentic Sicilian pronunciation of that. So much for the sibilants of modern Sicilian, already very complex. Now the question is, what were the sibilants of medieval Sicilian? And immediately we come across some serious problems, because this is a case of dispute amongst academics. This was the first thing that I noticed in trying to research this video. I will say as an aside, this was the most frustrating research process I've come across. The paucity of resources on what medieval Sicilian would have been pronounced as is frankly astonishing, given how important medieval Sicilian was to the formation of the modern Italian language. What I think we need to do here, though, is a bit of problem formulation. We need to understand exactly why it's so difficult to isolate medieval Sicilian, and then to find out what its phonology would have been. Almost certainly, there was a Romance language being spoken on the Sicilian island during the Middle Ages, but medieval Sicilian, as I refer to it, doesn't really exist. Certainly, it's not accepted terminology amongst academics. Why? Well, because Sicily has a long and complex history of invasions, conquests, and cultural imports and exports. To orient ourselves correctly, let's construct a rudimentary timeline. It's well known that Sicily was the center of Greek and Phoenician colonies in the classical era. But before that, naturally, there were indigenous people living on the island. The Illymians, the Sicanians, and the Sicels, and they must have spoken their own language. With time, however, some form of Greek was widely spoken on the island, and of course, during the Punic Wars, Sicily was incorporated as a Roman province as well. So we have a situation where the Romans, a Latin-speaking people in general, were ruling over a Greek-speaking population. Of course, in the late classical period, we have a lot of Byzantine influence as the capital of the Roman Empire moves eastward, and very importantly, in the 9th century, we have the establishment of the Aghlabid dynasty after the Arabic invasions of the island. This means that Arabic was an official language of administration in Sicily for a long period, but we are quite certain that Greek was widely spoken amongst the populace. Where during this long period of Aghlabid control was the Romance language spoken? Turns out that this is actually a point of great controversy. Most academics agree that there was some Romance language being spoken amongst the population, but they disagree as to what strata of society the Romance language speakers occupied. Certainly, we have lamentably little attestation of this early medieval Sicilian Romance. Things get a little bit clearer as we approach the turn of the millennium with the Norman invasions. This was a very slow process beginning already in the 900s, but which ultimately culminated in the establishment of a Norman kingdom of Sicily. Now, I don't want to delve too much into the historiography, but suffice it to say, for our purposes, that the Norman conquest of Sicily resulted in what we might consider a re-Latinization of the linguistics of the island as a whole. This doesn't mean that Arabic and Greek ceased to be spoken entirely. No, not at all. But rather that official Sicilian administration came more in line with Latin Christendom. And there's a dispute amongst historical linguists as to whether this introduced a new form of Romance in Sicily or permitted the existing form of Romance in Sicily to be more widely expressed. What we can be certain of, however, is that Norman rule in Sicily in time would lead to the establishment of the Scuola Siciliana in the court of Frederick II. This across the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Now, much can be said about the Scuola Siciliana, but for our purposes, we need to consider it as the motor of a literary movement that spanned across not only Sicily, but much of southern Italy during the reign of Frederick II. It contributed to the literary Tuscan that Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio would ultimately represent, and therefore to much of modern Standard Italian. Its importance can't be overstated, especially for this video, because it's one of the first instances we have of poetic expression in a Sicilian Romance language. Scholars tend to call the Romance language of the Sicilian poets Siciliano Aulico or Siciliano Illustre, and through that, I'd like to try and reconstruct what the sibilants might have been during this period in Sicily. This too is not without its difficulties, as I found in researching. You see, a lot of the poetry of the famous poets of the Scuola Siciliana actually comes to us through manuscript versions that were adopted into medieval Tuscan. Reconstructing what sibilants may have sounded like in Siciliano Illustre is not just simply indirect, it's labyrinthine at this point. But I'd like to give it my best try. And one of the poets that we can rely on here is Stefano Protonotari, for being the poet that was least Tuscanized in medieval transcriptions. That is to say, when we look at his poetry, we're looking at a form that, at least in terms of orthography, was not as dramatically changed as the poetry of other luminaries like Giacomo Lentini, for example. I kept saying Protonotari, but I meant to say Protonotaro. Please correct that until I click later on in the video and autocorrect myself. So I'd like to use Stefano Notari's most famous poem, Per meu cori allegrari, in order to try and reconstruct what some of these sibilants in medieval Sicilian might have sounded like. Now, I need to further emphasize that I have come across no research that explicitly provides us with reliable descriptions of the sibilants, but I have found extremely useful the various articles published on Treccani in their Federiciana collection published in 2005, and also Gerhard Rolf's Grammatica Storica della Lingua Italiana, Volume 1. What I'd like to do here is use Protonotaro's poem and move from what I consider the likeliest sibilants to the least likely sibilants in Siciliano Illustre. I'd like to start with the plain voiceless sibilant s, because this seems to be the most certain. It was likely written as a single s in most contexts, and almost certainly it's what's represented by the double s in Protonotaro's poem. I think this is the safest sibilant, to assume it's the most basic form of sibilant that exists across the Romance languages, both now and in the Middle Ages. Another sibilant sound that I find highly likely is the affricate t, and it's the sound I think is represented by the Z letter in the poem. Another sibilant I think is highly likely to have existed in Siciliano Illustre is the voiced affricate j, represented by G before I or E. All three of these, fortunately enough, we find in the opening lines of Protonotaro's poem, which I'll read out here if you don't mind me reading from a script. Per meu cori allegrari, chi molto longiamente senza allegranza e gioia d'amore è stato. There we go. 3 down, quite a few more to go. The next sibilant sound I hypothesize as likely, largely due to its potential similarity to the sibilant systems of other medieval Romance languages, and that is the voiced simple sibilant z. It's questionable whether this existed in phonemic distinction from the unvoiced s, but if I look at Protonotaro's poem, something that I find suspicious is that any instance when we see the grapheme S represented intervocalically, it's a double S. And that indicates to me that likely between vowels, we actually have the single S voiced. That is to say, it's a Z. And one of the reasons for this is that this is a broad tendency in the sibilant systems of medieval Romance. All vowels have to be voiced by definition, and so sometimes when you find a sibilant between them, a short sibilant between them, we tend to voice that as well. It just seems to be a path of least resistance sort of thing. There's this line, for example, in Protonotaro's poem, Homo chi avissi in alcun tempo amato. It's avisi to distinguish it potentially from avisi. I also think that it's highly likely that the unvoiced affricate ch existed in the Scuola Siciliana. We certainly see it in modern Sicilian, we see it in modern Italian. That doesn't mean absolutely that it did exist, but the fact that it exists in contemporary Romance across Europe makes me think that it likely existed in the Scuola in Siciliano Illustre as well. I'm going to go ahead and assume that that would have been represented with the grapheme C before I or E. So let's take this line, which fortunately happens to follow immediately after that first segment of the poem that I read to you, and let's apply these two sibilants, Z intervocalically and ch. Ca forsi levimenti da dimurranza tornirla inusitadi in du troppo taciri. Those 5 sibilants, s, z, j, ch, and ts, I think are the most likely to have existed in medieval Siciliano Illustre or Siciliano Aulico. I admit that I am working somewhat from the rather remarkable orthographical standardization that we find in other medieval Romance languages in order to reach some kind of conclusion here. But if I were to make a general observation, it's that medieval Romance languages seem to have remarkably broad sibilant systems, and I don't see any reason to hypothesize that Sicilian would be any different. If anything, I would think Sicilian would have perhaps a slightly broader system if we consider its exposure to Greek, to Arabic, and also to the Gallo-Italici dialects of the Normans. Another sibilant sound that we associate with modern Italian is the unvoiced fricative sh. Did Sicilian have one? I have no idea. But if we look at one of the poems of Giacomo Lentini, admittedly a highly Tuscanized version of the poem, we do actually see the grapheme SCI pop up. And that makes me wonder, perhaps medieval Sicilian had this sound as well. There's always a chance that this was completely introduced by Tuscan copyists, but if it did exist in medieval Sicilian, I'd at least like to read you this extract with its pronunciation. This is from Giacomo Lentini's famous poem Meravigliosamente, in which he praises the beauty of a woman that he knows. Getto uno gran sospiro ca facimi angosciare, e certo bene angoscio, ca pena mi conosco. A sibilant sound I feel a lot less confident in just assuming existed in Siciliano Illustre is je, the voiced version of the sh sibilant. And something I find highly unlikely to have existed is that modern, amazing retroflex sibilant. As in the example we used earlier, naturalmente è costretto a rientrare e lo papa lo scomunica. Now that was my audacious attempt to make some assertions, educated guesses as to what medieval Sicilian might have sounded like. Now, the last thing I would ever want to do is not show sufficient respect to something I genuinely care about. I would really love to learn Sicilian one day, and I really hope that the academic resources in order to access what medieval Sicilian phonology would have been become more widespread. I seriously struggled to find adequate research on this. In fact, this was the hardest video I've ever had to research. If any of you can point me in the direction of more authoritative resources, please let me know. And this is important because I will need some help going forward. In the next videos on this series, I'm going to try and cover what the sibilants of medieval Neapolitan would have been, and later, somewhat more easily, the sibilants of medieval Venetian and medieval Tuscan. Asking, as always, for your support and academic help in that area. I want to thank you very much for perhaps in a way putting up with an episode that was a little bit less streamlined and structured than normal, necessarily so, and I hope to see you in the next video. Grazie mille e ciao.